those online. So welcome to everyone online. I'm Carol Brayne. I'm co-director of Cambridge Public Health, and it is my honour to chair this panel today. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today to address this question: the government's healthy eating strategy. Can we afford to scrap it? So I'm going to stop sharing my slides so that you can see our wonderful panelists. Here we go. And we have Dr. Dolly Tice from the MRC Epidemiology Unit, Professor Theresa Marteau from the Behavioral and Health Research Unit, and Professor Giles Yeo from the MRC Metabolic Diseases Unit. And you are very welcome. This is a webinar of the global Cambridge, two interdisciplinary research centres, Cambridge Global Food Security and Public Health. And it's part of a series of Food for Thought panel events. So it's one in a sequence. Now, just some kind of housekeeping things. So your microphones and cameras are off and will remain so throughout. The event's being recorded, as you heard at the beginning, and you're very welcome to use the Q&A function throughout the event to put questions. The chat and raise hand functions are probably disabled, but we will keep an eye on them as well. We really want to get into this question today and sort of think about the potential, because it's such an important area, and it's got resonance beyond food in many ways, because it is about policy and the way that policy can shape health into the future, and how it can work in positive ways and negative ways, and how things get knocked around basically as footballs in the public domain. So we're going to have very short presentations from our panelists to begin with, but before we do that, we would like you to do an audience poll, and this will come up just now, and we would like you to answer this. Do we have a real choice in what we eat and be healthy? And if you could just quickly click it, and then we'll do it before, and we'll come back to it afterwards to see if we've got any change in the distribution of answers. So just over the next seconds, if you could fill that in, and then perhaps close that window on your screens. Okay, great. Okay, so I'd like to introduce first Dolly, and ask Dolly to give her pitch. Over to you, Dolly.
Thank you so much, Carol, and great to be here. So I'm going to give a very brief sort of setting of the policy scene before we get into the meatier parts of the discussion. So just to paint a picture of where we're at now, we currently have a government that is still seeing through, but not quite seeing through, currently threatening to scrap the latest government strategy that was published in 2020 under the last Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. So that was the last healthy eating strategy. It was called Tackling Obesity and contained numerous policies. It was the 14th government strategy in England alone to tackle the issue of obesity, so containing these healthy eating policies. And we've had these 14 government strategies over the last 30 years, and they contained 689 individual policies. So we've had almost 700 policies in the last 30 years trying to tackle the issue of obesity. So that's not just the healthy eating policies, but activity policies as well as weight management policies. We also have had numerous independent government reviews commissioned and published over the last 30 years as well. And the most recent one, which many of you will be familiar with, is the National Food Strategy that was commissioned by the government and led by Henry Dimbleby, and that was published last year in 2021. one. And we did have the formal response to it published earlier this year in the Food Strategy White Paper, as well as some of the response policies in the Levelling Up White Paper as well. But we have also had another change in government. So we are on another Prime Minister and another set of threats to this agenda. So we haven't had the greatest year when it comes to progress on this, but I'm going to end before handing over on a positive that the latest Public Health Minister, Dr. Caroline Johnson, did say at the Conservative Party conference that she was interested in breaking that cycle of repeated publishing of strategies and policies and wanted to emphasize and focus more on action. So maybe this marks the start of a new wave of government action rather than just the publishing of repeated policies.
Thanks, Dolly. That's great. A great introduction. So we're going to go on to Theresa now. So Theresa.
Thanks very much, Carol, and thanks, Dolly. Addressing the question, the government's healthy eating strategy, can we afford to scrap it? I'm going to start by saying it depends, and say, yes, we can afford to scrap it, provided it's replaced by a more effective policy, such as a national food strategy, outlined, already mentioned by Dolly, which could achieve two linked government ambitions. First, to halve childhood obesity by 2030, and the second, to achieve net zero by 2050. And both of those depend on having an effective national food strategy, as along the lines of that outlined by Henry Dimbleby in his review. But if government is not proposing to replace the current strategy that was published in July 2020 with a more effective one, then no, I don't think we can afford to scrap it. And that's for two reasons. First, the importance of the problem. Rates of obesity are high, and in some groups, they're rising. For example, last year, the latest data on rates of obesity in children showed, rather than 2030 achieving a halving of childhood obesity, we're on track to double rates of childhood obesity compared to 2018. And not only that, the gap in rates of obesity and overweight between the children, 10-year-olds living in the most deprived areas, where at the moment 34% are living with obesity, compares with 14% of their peers who are now living with obesity in the least deprived, the most affluent areas. So that gap has been growing. On the positive side, if we have effective policies that can tackle unhealthy diets and obesity, there's at least a quadruple win. We'll have healthier adults and children, we'll reduce inequalities, we'll reduce the costs of the NHS, and by some estimates, we could increase GDP by up to 3%. So that's the first reason why we shouldn't scrap the current strategy. The second reason is because the current proposal strategy published in 2020 has the potential to be more effective in tackling obesity and inequalities than previous strategies, the 14 strategies that have gone before. And that's because it includes more interventions than we've currently seen that change the environments which are shaping our behaviour, which is resulting in our unhealthy diets contributing to obesity. So 3 of the proposals included in that strategy are first, removing junk food. I'm using that as a catch-all term, from prominent positions in shops, and that was introduced on the 1st of October. 2 other proposals that would change the environments that currently make it more likely that our diets are unhealthy are to restrict advertising of junk food on TV and online. And the third is to restrict what are called volume productions on promotions rather on junk food, such as buy one, get one free. So the fact that these are in the current strategy shows that back in 2020, when that was designed, government and the policy advisors weren't falling prey to what psychologists sometimes call the fundamental attribution error. So just to explain, that's a common misperception, common amongst general populations and unfortunately also amongst policymakers, whereby we overestimate how much of our behaviour is shaped by what's inside our heads, so our goals, our intentions, and we underestimate how much of our behaviour is driven by cues in our environment, often very subtle, that we're not aware of. And that is reflected in many of the strategies that Dolly has already mentioned over the last 3 decades, strategies that have not yet been successful. So I just, before I end, just to illustrate that fundamental attribution error from a study that was conducted in the Netherlands a few years ago, in which they repositioned healthier food and healthier snacks, put them nearer the tills. And that resulted in an increase in sales of the healthier snacks, almost doubling. And when they asked people whether they noticed any difference, 9 out of 10 said no, nothing had changed. And when they were told that actually this had increased the sales of healthier snacks, a similar majority denied that it had affected them. So we don't notice when our behavior changes, but these cues are really important. So the current strategy it's not a panacea, but it is the beginning, and it marks an important shift towards an evidence-based set of policies which are going to reshape the environments that are currently driving our behavior towards less healthy foods. And if we manage to change those by keeping the current policy, then we're on our way towards those quadruple wins that I outlined earlier. I'll end there.
Thanks, Theresa. That's terrific. Right, and on to Giles.
Thank you so much, Carol. So I'm a geneticist, oddly enough. What the hell is a geneticist doing here? And I studied the genetics of body weight. And now we within the field understand that studying the genetics of body weight is by its very definition studying the genetics of how our brain influences our feeding behavior. Okay, so why am I telling you all of this, right? And in very many ways, saying that there is huge genetic influences in body weight, and it estimates that heritability, so the percentage of the variation of the feeding behavior and body weight, that's actually down to genes, is anywhere between 40 and 70%. So actually, this is sort of music to the ears of many in the industry, because they're saying, oh, okay, so it's your genes, nothing to do with us, nothing to do with the environment. But here's the thing, right? When we are studying, and odd that a geneticist should say this, but geneticists do not study genes in isolation. We study genes in the way they respond to the environment. And the environment can be anything. The environment can be, do you commute to work? The environment can be, well, are you a parent? Where do you live? The environment can also be your socioeconomic status. And so this is where I want to just focus my thoughts on. So as Theresa had already mentioned, the bottom quintile of society from a socioeconomic perspective, certainly in this country, and I think the same in the United States, are twice as likely to end up with obesity as someone in the top quintile of the socioeconomic class. And I just almost think that it's pretty much everybody, if not everybody, on this call at the moment, twice as likely. There is no genetic difference between rich and poor. It's an accident of birth. Okay, so why this doubling of risk of obesity? If speaking as a geneticist, well, it's because the environment influences those who are most susceptible. Let's put it this way: if you happen to be susceptible to a specific environment, if you place yourself in a poor environment, you're more likely to actually end up eating that less healthy food. So I think privilege comes in a number of different flavors, shall I say. Privilege can be cash. Okay, we're talking about privilege can be time. But most of all, if you mix the two together, cash and time, what privilege brings you is choices. And the lower down the socioeconomic ladder you go, the fewer choices you actually have. And so what is actually happening is if you go down, if you are like us, okay, and have hummus and carrot sticks in our fridge when we're hungry and happen to be susceptible, well, that's fine. Okay, that's just the way it goes. Whereas if you're actually lacking in choices, you're time poor, cash poor, therefore choice poor, and what you then put in front of you happens to be unhealthy, which sadly is the case at the moment, then that is part of the reason why there's the doubling in obesity rates. So if you are trying to remove some of the buy one get one frees, bulk buys, and are claiming, meaning the government are claiming that, well, removing these is actually going to be better for those who are poorer because it gives them more food, right? It actually gives them more food. Except you're driving inequalities. And I think this is part of the problem. You are now trying to make food. Look, I think inherently there probably aren't unhealthy foods and healthy foods inherently, to my mind. There are some foods you can eat more of and other foods you want to eat less of, okay? If we are going to make foods that we should eat less of cheaper, all that is going to do is to widen inequalities, is to get people who are cash and time poor, driving them towards more unhealthy choices. I think what we need to do, okay, I know there's no magical money tree, but poverty, I want to point out, ladies and gentlemen, is a political choice. It is. There is no magical money tree, but we're picking what to spend the money on. So we need to make sure that healthy food that is cheaper. We need to make sure that if you are forced to make a limited number of choices, that by default, the choices you make are healthier. And removing the buy one, get one free, and all of the other things that are actually in the government strategy does not help this at all. All it does is make people who can ill afford it choose unhealthier foods. That is not saving anyone any money, any time, and certainly anybody's health. I'll end there.
Thanks, that's really great. And it's lovely to hear a very biological person promoting the Rose hypothesis. Those who are public health and epidemiologists in the audience will know the Rose hypothesis, which is about basically the distribution within a particular context, and you can shift things up or down depending on the context, and you have more people in the extreme ends. If you have an environment in which it's unhealthy things are very prominent, and it's of course not just food, it's many other things as well. So we've had a wonderful introduction to the topic, and what I'd like to do is ask, just before we move on to the questions, we've got some questions already, but I just wanted to, if you want to provide a brief reflection on what the others have said, just very quickly. Dolly, are we doomed to more of these dusty reports on shelves?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I've been writing about it today, and it is a problem just not only with government strategies themselves, getting dusty and there being a celebration around an announcement, but also with organisations outside of government too, that often the publication of a policy report or recommendations can so often be seen as sort of the end, the job done, and then responsibility is handed over. But there are a couple of other reasons why we end up in this repeated cycle of policies being proposed and scrapped, despite having the evidence of all of the, these issues and how the policies can potentially work and do work in practice. I should say that the scrapping is already unusual because policies more often than not don't even get implemented in the first place. So when we're talking about policies being scrapped, that's already for a much smaller proportion of policies that actually make it through to the implementation stage. But the scrapping of policies can also be on policy ideas. So you often get this situation like we have had so repeatedly repeatedly in the last few years because of the frequent change in government, where policy ideas are proposed and government says we will do X, Y, and Z, whether it's restrictions on unhealthy food promotions in supermarkets, and then they don't remain in office to see that policy all the way through. So then that idea gets handed over, and that's where we often see it at the kind of threatening to be scrapped stage. But there is this huge desire to be different, even by new governments of the same political party. And we've had the same political party since 2015, with 4 prime ministers now, and each one will come in and try and differentiate themselves from the previous one, which more often than not includes the getting rid of any policies or strategies handed over. But the history shows that more often than not, these governments then end up proposing almost exactly the same policies once they've got their head around the issue. And we've seen that very much in the last few years. A lot of that is because the understanding of the actual agenda, particularly around healthy eating, is very poor. And it's until people look at the data, policymakers look at the data and get their head around the issue, that they then are persuaded of the role of government on this. And you will basically never find a public health minister to leave that department and not be completely committed to this whole agenda once they've actually had to deal with the issue and see it up close. It's also got a very low political prioritization as an agenda. You very rarely get politicians who lead on healthy eating as their thing. So you very rarely get a politician that will build their legacy on a healthy eating agenda. And we found this, I did some research last year, and we interviewed parliamentarians and special advisors about who they could see leading on this, and not one could name any of their colleagues as leading on this. They struggled to think of a name. The names that did come to mind were sort of the obvious, Jamie Oliver, and then some mentioned Henry Dimbleby as well, but there are just so few politicians and policymakers who are known to be leading on this. It's also massively an agenda that seems to clash with people's beliefs and ideologies. So there's a perception that, the role of the state is not needed or shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's great, because I think I'm pretty certain that some of the questions will kind of stray into this territory as well. But that's great. So just Theresa, any brief reflections before we get on to the questions? Yes. That sort of sense of somebody to lead it and who is sustainable themselves.
Yeah, just to add, I started out my comments by talking about 2 linked ambitions in government. One is concerning obesity, childhood obesity. The other is net zero 2050. And food, supply, demand, what we eat, what we grow, is absolutely critical to achieving net zero 2050. There's a report coming out tomorrow from a House of Lords group who've been looking at behaviour change in the context of climate. And I think the more that we can weave those 2 policy agendas together, they are inextricably linked. I don't think we should be talking about healthy without talking about sustainable food. And that indeed was what Henry Dimbleby's report did. And given that net zero 2050 is enshrined in law, then I think that there is more hope. It doesn't help with smoking, but certainly if we're just looking at food systems, then I think that gives me some pause for optimism.
And Chris Whitty is in some public settings has said, you can tuck a lot of things under one big flagship. If you can get in one way, you can often address more than one area. So
it's a win-win, as they say.
Yeah. And Giles, any reflections before we go on to questions? We've actually got tons of questions, so we're going to have to be sort of...
I think a reflection, I'll just swing back to my genetic background. And I'm not a believer in it. I think the data shows that for very many people, food intake decisions and hence body weight is not really that much of a choice for biological and for environmental reasons. And I think this is the message we need to hammer home to our policymakers, because at the moment, whatever they say, personal responsibility is the first line of defense. Always. Maybe they do believe it, but it's certainly cheaper, to say that personal responsibility. Whereas we know that's not the pure. There's some personal responsibility. It's my body's health. It's my children's health, of course. but I do think we need to hammer home the point, the policy point, that if we treat eating behavior as something that has very little choice in it, then we need to have a public health solution to a public health problem. And so therefore that means tackling the health, and we'll do that, but that also means tackling the environment.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks. So we've got a great kind of base from which to build. So I'm going to ask the very first question, which is, if people want to eat unhealthy food, isn't it their choice? So Dolly, this comes back to you. Isn't it their choice? And why should government direct them and tell them what to eat? What about the nanny state, which is, it has kind of come right back to the fore in the current regime?
This is one of my sort of pet peeves with this agenda, is that it's perceived as telling people what to do. And the most effective and equitable policies, we know, are not about telling people what to do, but about creating the conditions that make eating healthy easy and accessible and affordable for all. So the notion of telling people what to do is actually, the evidence shows that that's sort of information campaign style policies, which aren't likely to be effective and equitable, because the assumptions are that you'll engage with that information, change your behavior and be able to do all of that easily. And that's actually incredibly difficult, particularly for people who are living in poverty or face disproportionately more difficult circumstances. So that perception of nanny statism, meaning telling people what to do, is a fundamental misunderstanding of a lot of the policies, which aren't about telling, they're about shaping the environment to make it easier.
Yeah, so this comes to Theresa and Giles. I mean, how do you change the language away from this? And I can see that there's a role for the biologist to say, you've got it wrong. But Theresa, you first on the nanny state.
My beef, as it were, with the nanny state is that term, which demonizes attempts to protect populations. And in this example, we're talking about protecting the health of populations. It's not new. Reforms, sanitary reforms in the middle of the 19th century were deemed to be overreach by the state. The Times famously talking about Chadwick's reforms on getting water and sorting out sewage in London, as actually cholera was better than having public health measures forced upon the population. And I think two observations. First, there's huge amount of money, billions of pounds and dollars are spent by companies lobbying government using this term nanny state in order to keep adults and children smoking, consuming alcohol, and eating junk food. So there's a huge interest here. Having said that, I think there is a legitimate question that the use of this term it just closes down debate, but there is a legitimate question for debate about what is the role of the state, where does it begin and where does it end? So I don't know what alternative we can use, and many people have tried to find one, but I think as soon as you hear the term nanny state, stop, be on guard, and try to shift the debate to where it should be held.
Thanks. And Giles, any sort of how can your as it were world help shift this language?
Yeah, so it's this concept of telling people what to do, when actually what happens is in very many ways, by look, for those of us actually on this call, we can choose what to do. It doesn't actually really matter whether or not they tax a little bit extra on sugar, or whether or not or on alcohol, or whether or not we don't get the buy one get one free. The savings to those of us who have the choice, okay, are actually very, very small and very small. And at the end of the day, if I want a chocolate bar, I'll walk down the aisle and I'll buy myself a chocolate bar, okay? And if I don't, I don't. The issue okay, is right at the lowest, the poorest people in society. They don't have a choice. So in effect, what you're doing is you're forcing them to make the unhealthy choice because you're making that the cheaper choice. So you have to look at it in the other way around, where by saying that you don't want to tell people what to do, it's a privileged view of our food environment. On top of that, you have to remember what human beings, from a biological perspective, are hardwired to do. Okay, first of all, what are baby mammals, children? What are they designed to do when they pop out? They're designed to eat and grow as quickly as possible to avoid becoming tiger food. That's their goal, all right? And so they latch on to the richest and highest caloric density source of nutrients there is, the boob, okay, in order to do that. So children, just as an example, will never pick celery over a chocolate bar, ever, because they're hardwired to go for high calorie foods. So we also have to protect the children in this scenario. So I think telling people what to do, we're framing it wrong. It's a privileged view.
Thanks. Okay, so let's move on.
Just as a quick reminder, sorry. So as you've so clearly said, Giles, there is a patterning of obesity by deprivation, but across the whole population, 64% of adults in the UK are overweight or obese. So it's not just existing there. So where people do have more cash, more time, less stress, still our food environments are flooded with the foods that are leading to poor health. So I'm not taking away from what you said, but I just want to remind people that this isn't entirely a problem of poverty.
All you have to do is look at the photos. Just look at the photos from 20, 30 years ago. Absolutely extraordinary. Well, not 40 years ago, maybe. And also think about Cambridge Station. Cambridge Station used to have no food. Well, it had a pub, I think. That was all. No food outlets at all. Okay, good. Let's go on to a question which was received pretty early on. And I need you to say who would like to answer this, but why is it cheaper to produce unhealthy food than healthy food? Could an economic switch happen more easily than we think to providing better food at slightly higher prices? And the corollary of that is about how much we spend on our food compared to other countries. Giles.
So I think there is a nuanced answer here. I mean, undoubtedly, the reason why a lot of the ultra-processed foods, shall we say, we should not eat so much of, is cheap is because A, they're industrialized, which means they're economies of scale, and B, they have very long shelf lives. As a result, they're cheap. They're easy to move, they're easy to store, they have very long shelf lives. And so very, just inherently, they're actually cheaper than a carrot, which is cheap, but will rot after a while. So there is a storage issue. You might then ask the question, well, what's wrong with ultra processed foods? And a big problem with ultra processed foods is they're inherently low in fiber and in protein. That's part of the problem. So I think that is probably why it is actually cheaper. Now, is there any way of actually switching the market to make healthy food? So I think here's the nuance. I think we're not trying to ask Mars, other chocolate bars are available, to make carrots, because that's a stupid thing. They don't grow carrots. I would argue that we need to try and get the companies that are making their niche foods, whatever it is they make, cereals, chocolate bars, and what have you, to make those foods healthier, somehow make them healthier, somehow reformulate them to be healthier. And I think that would be a more pragmatic way of going about things.
That's a really interesting approach. So Theresa, I think just linking that question to the net zero, I just wondered whether you could respond as well.
Yeah. So I think it's incredibly difficult, and that indeed is what the huge volume that Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy was addressing, because it's looking at a fundamental shift in farming, if you like, the supply, as well as the foods that we end up having before us. I've just joined Eat Lancet 2 as a commissioner, and some of you may be familiar with Eat Lancet 1, which was designing what a planetary healthy diet would look like. And in order to achieve a healthy diet that is available to everybody within planetary boundaries, it needs a fundamental change in how we farm, what we grow, as well as the food we produce and its availability. So it's absolutely not simple. I think that there are an increasing number of science-led reports on what we need to do, but in order to get there, it's incredibly difficult. I think that if we're thinking about people today, I would suggest two things, which I think Giles has already indicated. The first, we were talking about poverty, about increasing incomes in the lowest households. And there's very little evidence on this that I've been able to find, but some natural experiments have shown that where the incomes of the lowest income households increase, it has, for many, a surprising effect. They decrease their spend on tobacco, decrease their spend on alcohol, and increase their spend on fruit and vegetables. And it's thought that one of the mechanisms for that is about decreasing stress in those households. I think the other thing that we could look at, but again, this is incredibly difficult, is shifting subsidies. So, for instance, worldwide, there are a huge number of subsidies on farming, most of which are for foods that are damaging the planet, damaging our climate, and damaging our health. So shifting those subsidies so that the healthier, more sustainable foods become more affordable, and those that are damaging people and the planet become more expensive. So true costs.
Thanks very much. That's great. There are quite a few questions about how we shift, how we sort of shift things, and we have, thank you all for your questions. They're great. So, for example, is it economically viable to return to a non-obesogenic environment, or is this counter to capitalism? What is the role of public engagement in the space, which could put pressure on government, which has a libertarian focus? So I think this sort of section of the questions, for which many thanks, and there are about 3 or 4 here as I scan through them. I just wonder whether you can just reflect on what are the mechanisms that we have with the evidence base to try to change the rhetoric in the public. I mean, what are our mechanisms given the challenges of a report and its implementation? There are other methods available to us. So, Dolly.
Yeah, so really, I mean, this links to the previous question, and I would just point again to the National Food Strategy, because the recommendation for the salt and sugar tax was absolutely designed to tackle this issue. And as Theresa said, it's sort of about that rebalancing. So health taxes more generally are used increasingly globally to tackle this issue. It's not about a rebalancing, not only about a rebalancing the system, it's also about the signaling to which direction the food industry should be moving towards when it comes to population and planetary health, the types of products it should be producing, and the nature in which it markets those products, etc., etc. So health taxes are a very effective way to do that. And the evidence shows in terms of increasing political acceptability of health taxes, that earmarking the funds for certain provisions or programs, for example, is a very effective way at increasing political acceptability of them. And we saw that with the soft drinks industry levy, that the earmarking of that revenue for food provision programs is something that is still being used today to sort of try and increase the political acceptability of these things, and show that actually it can not only help make good food more affordable for low-income families, but it can shift the attention of the food industry away from producing high sugar drinks, for example, towards that reformulation direction. But it's something that needs to obviously be ever monitored, because we don't know what the long-term effects are of reformulating, and whether just the sheer volume of ultra-processed food is something that needs to be addressed altogether. And I think that's where the combination of health taxes with marketing policies and labeling policies, for example, can be incredibly effective. And we always sort of within public health talk about needing multiple policy approaches, but it's true because it's such a complex system.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just thinking about the multiple systems, and just moving on to some of the topic areas of some of the other questions. What about local systems? So what role can local systems have in trying to change this? And in some ways that comes back to the natural experiment that you mentioned, Theresa, because presumably that was done on a locality basis. In terms of, or to particular targeted groups, the reduction of poverty. But Theresa, what do you think about local systems?
Yes, local is good, and there are many community groups, and it's who are working towards healthier, but particularly more sustainable food systems. And I think it's interesting that there's more action from the population in civil society organizations for climate than there are for health, which I've always found really, really interesting. But given that they are twinned, particularly linked when we're talking about food systems, I think that that's really good. I just wanted to link back to what Dolly was saying and what you were asking about in terms of engaging publics and citizens in policy. I think it's absolutely crucial, and publics can be involved. There's a spectrum of ways of engaging publics in policy. At one level, if you like, at the sort of least engaged but really important level, is just communicating with publics about policies. And we've done some work looking at the communicating the effectiveness of policies in achieving valued outcomes. Now, we know that health is a priority area whenever people are asked, what have you thought about in the last few weeks that's been a concern to you? Invariably, say in international surveys, invariably health, my health or the health of my family comes up top, and it trumps climate concerns, but they're competitive though, so they're both pretty high. So we know that people are really concerned about these things, and when they're provided with evidence that a policy can be effective in achieving a health outcome, in a systematic review that we conducted, we found across policy areas, this can increase public support by around 4%. Doesn't sound much, but actually, you know, referenda and elections have been won on less. And importantly, if you provide people with evidence of ineffectiveness, support goes down. So at that very simple level, and I think that there's more that can be done, particularly on the buy one, get one free offers, which seem to be muddling many of our politicians, let alone the general public. So I think more effective communication of that. And at the other end, we've got things like citizens' assemblies. So we had one in the UK, unfortunately interrupted by COVID, on climate change. And what we can see from those citizens' assemblies in the various jurisdictions, so in France, Ireland, the UK, invariably publics, when they've been able to deliberate, when they've seen the evidence, they've been engaging with experts, they are much more keen on effective interventions that are going to change the systems that at the moment are not enabling healthy and a sustainable life for people. So I think more of that, because it's just engaging people feel less helpless, and we're going to get more effective policies.
Great. Thanks. That's a passionate sort of endorsement of the public engagement. Giles, you're a public presenter. how do you see your role? There are quite a few questions for you actually about reformulating junk food and ultra processed foods and so on, and why do the affluent become, why do we have overweight affluent people? But just if you could start off with the role of the public presenter.
I think the role of the, so okay, let's in fact, let's just look at the past 3 years. My job, in very many ways, as my public presenter hat on, has been made easier by the last 3 years. And I think what we've seen over the last 3 years is that we have seen some wonderful examples of science communication, but we have also seen some god-awful examples of science communication. And what is crystal clear, certainly with something like COVID, is that bad science communication kills. Now, but this is not unique to COVID. It's just the existential threat that's out there. We're thinking about it. Diet-related illnesses, which form the vast majority of the burden of non-communicable diseases that human beings face, okay, will also kill. In fact, it kills far more every single year than COVID does, over a different tempo, but it kills. And so I'd like to think that we, not only science communicators as, in capital science communicators, but all scientists, all academics have a duty, I think, to sort of leverage the advantage that we've got from here in order to then spread the word about their own fields, including what we're talking about here, including diet-related illnesses and what we need to do in order to tackle these diet-related illnesses. Bad science communication kills.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it's quite difficult, I think, for journalists to know who to go to. How do you kite mark messaging when, of course, we disagree amongst ourselves sometimes about the messaging? Just Giles, just to answer that question on, what do you think drives the obesity in the more affluent as well? I mean, I suspect you'll come straight back to the Rose thing, which is if you've got an environment in which it's easy to become obese, that people will become obese in every.
No, that's not necessarily true or all. So this is where genetics comes into play. So the heritability of body weight, this doesn't matter whether or not you're small, medium size, or large, okay, across the entire spectrum, is between 40 and 70%. So wide is range. And it's a range because of the role the environment plays. So if we go back, there's a study by a colleague of mine, Claire Llewellyn, down in London, UCL, and she runs the Gemini study, a twin study. And so she's got these twins, identical twins, non-identical twins, 100% of genetic material, 50% of genetic material. If you study enough twins, you can figure out the role of the environment versus the genes. Sorry, I just thought I'd get that out there. So, but interestingly, what information Gemini collects is also socioeconomic and obesogenic status of the specific families. And here's the interesting thing. In the poorest households that she actually had with the twins, the heritability of body weight is maxed out at 70%. Okay, whereas in the most affluent households, that halves to about 30 to 40%. Okay, where there is still a substantial volume of heritability, clearly for body weight, but the environment makes a difference in terms of how much it amplifies it. So put simply, if you are less likely to say no to a slice of pizza or to food, then it's far better to be in a household with carrots and hummus in your fridge than it is to be living above a kebab shop, put very, very simply. And so the people who are driven to eat because of genetic reasons and hence to be larger will always have that, okay, and that is biological. But how they respond to it because of the environment will differ. But there will be larger affluent people as well. That's the reason.
Okay, thanks. I've got one last question before I ask you all to reflect on the discussion we've had so far on the questions, and that is came through in the questions, which is it's slightly sort of it's not tangential. It's very, very important, but it's not your areas as such. But it's about the stigma of obesity, because all this discussion does, and out there, and including the kind of the choice thing, it's your choice to be fat, to be obese or be overweight. how do we address, in parallel with all of the things that we've been discussing, how do we address that really, really fundamental challenge, which is the very great stigma that there is associated with obesity and overweight in our cultures? Giles.
Oddly enough, I'm the director of a new organization we just found out, because I'm not trying to sell anything here, called All About Obesity, and it's a charity set up to fight weight stigma. Its primary role is to actually set up the fight weight stigma, and weight stigma is real. It's out there. I think it's one of the last Rubicons to be crossed, shall we say, when it comes to what we can actually say about, today, if as a public figure you commented on someone's gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, in any way, shape, or form, you'll be fired, you lose your job. But yet you are able to comment about someone else's weight. So therefore, weight stigma is there. I think there are a number of different things. I think we clearly have to have public communication to policy, to all across all of society, that body weight is not a choice. Okay, broadly speaking, it isn't. Okay, people think it is, but it actually isn't. It's not to say that people who are larger are not tend to be more unhealthy. So I think we need, as a mature society, to be able to hold two thoughts in our head. We have to be able to think that, listen, carrying too much fat is going to be bad for you. Okay, how much it differs between different people, but that we shouldn't be blaming the people actually suffering from the conditions. We don't have cancer stigma, dementia stigma, rheumatoid arthritis stigma. How come we have weight stigma? And I think that's part of the problem. And this is part of the communication of making sure the science gets out there about the biology underlying body weight.
Thanks. I think that's a very important message. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask you each to just reflect briefly on the conversation, and perhaps, I mean, really briefly, particularly a message about what the public can do about eating in a healthy way and putting pressure on. And Theresa, to some extent you've answered that, but just to very, very briefly, Dolly.
Thank you. I think the point on communication is where I think the most important role that anyone can play on this agenda is around communication, and stigma and the political barriers of perception and communication block. So not only understanding how people think about it,
I think, Dolly,
and trying to align with the way that people think about the world better. So when it comes to politics, can you?
Yeah, your internet
okay.
is a little bit dodgy. Yeah, yes. I think though I think we've understood what you're saying. Yeah. So communication.
I'll hand.
Yeah. So hand over to.
Hand over as it better.
Yeah. Thanks, Theresa.
Yes, to add to what's already been said, what can we do as, I'm going to reflect on what we can do as citizens. Dolly was talking about communication. I think in a democratic society, writing to your MP. I also think that as citizens, engaging with others in the community, and if you have any voice or potential authority over environments where there are food, such as if you're a school governor or in your own workplace, then work with others to see what can you do to create a food environment that's healthier and more sustainable than the existing one, and set up discussions on that. It's really difficult to do. Just as a footnote, Carol, in the Institute of Public Health, where weekly we would have a meeting, 10, 15 minutes, different groups would bring cake and fruit, and we'd talk about latest findings. And I remember a couple of occasions, I would just bring fruit, fresh and dried fruit, delicious, and raise the question, why do we bring ultra-processed food, cakes, to these meetings when many of us in this building are attempting to try to limit how much people are eating these foods? quite resistant, but because we're scientists, somebody volunteered to go away and ran a survey amongst all those who were attending, and guess what won?
Biscuits.
It's the cake. And so it's tough amongst the experts to change these environments. So I'd encourage people, it's not easy, but see where you can go. And I think my other message would be to researchers, which is the evidence that we've been talking about. It's there to show that changing environments has the potential to change our behavior in ways that can tackle some of the diet-related problems that we've been talking about. But we do need to generate more evidence and synthesize it and strengthen it. Governments come and go, and so one needs to be prepared for when a government has realized that this should be a high priority, then we've got our evidence lined up.
Yeah, and it's the economic evidence, it's sort of the way that it feeds the politicians. If they can make the decision and make it sustainable and carry across and make it cross-party, I guess.
And communicate the evidence in a way that's accessible.
Yeah, and Giles?
I mean, I think leaving it to human decision, I think is always a poor decision. I really believe that as a society, from policymakers all the way down, however we do it, we need to make the healthier choice, the easier, cheaper, and more convenient choice. The moment that happens, now I'm not saying it's easy, but the moment that happens, it will fix itself, because now there's no choice, there's no anything, it just happens to be cheaper and easier. And so people will do it because we're human beings. And I think that is what we should strive towards rather than talking about anything else. So make the healthier foods more accessible, tastier even. Okay, I mean, look, can't be beyond the wit of a company to make healthy foods really super tasty. And I think that's what we should do, and that's the way to solving this problem, or at least partially solving this problem. Thanks.
Yeah, and it always strikes me that actually our dependence on fossil fuels is one of the reasons for our obesity as societies. And there was an interesting reflection on the Cuban crisis of when they had their oil blockade and they couldn't get oil from the Soviet Union I think it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so they didn't have oil, and so they couldn't run the cars, and obesity went down dramatically because everybody had to go on to their bikes. It's a very curious natural experiment, but it's one that's out there and it's never drawn on, which is fascinating. Probably not least because of the political environment in which the Cubans live. Okay, so I think we've had a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. Now we'd just like to put this poll up again and see whether your reflections have changed. So if you could just do that again. We can't vote, so we'll just wait for you for a moment. And we'll hope that Helen and Fran are keeping tabs on it for when we get a majority of responses to let us know. But we've ranged pretty widely, but I mean, there've been some very consistent messages here, and it feels as though, you know, it is possible that we can move towards something that creates a better environment for individuals at local and sort of through local and national and public action, and that we can all play a role. So you've heard all of those things today. That's great. So 99%. So we moved from, let me just say, 91% said yes to should the government intervene and guide us on what to eat in the first poll. 99% of those who are still here, we have lost a few people. And 57 said no to the second question, which was, do we have a real choice in what we eat? And 69% now say so. It has, so your views, depending on the missingness, do seem to have changed a little bit. So thank you all for joining. I hope you've enjoyed it, as well as been provoked by it and also inspired by our wonderful speakers. And I'd like to thank Helen and Fran and for all the background work that leads to all the organisation of such a webinar. And just to note, keep an eye out for the next webinar on the Food for Thought panel events. So thank you all. Thank you again. Thanks to our speakers.